Yeah, so my name is Peter Swanton, and I'm a Guwaarrgay man. I was born, though, in Mackay in North Queensland, up on Yui country. Um, and in 2016, I decided that I wanted to do astronomy and astrophysics. And so I moved to Canberra, down here in Ngunnawal Ngambri country, where I still live now. I did a Bachelor of Science at ANU, where I majored in physics and specialized in astronomy and astrophysics. And yeah, so like Ryan said, I originally started working in black holes and quasars and AGN and stuff that you may have heard of from some of the amazing speakers that have come before me in this. But I actually I had a talk with Brad Tucker, who was my supervisor at the time, and I said, look, I love doing this stuff, but there's no connection for me between black holes and AGN and my sort of cultural background. And so that's when I shifted my focus over to cultural astronomy, a bit of what we'll talk about today. So I'll jump right into it. And I like to start with this one here. So this is the Southern Cross, which most of you that, at least the ones of you that live in the Southern Hemisphere, should be a little bit familiar with. It's obviously on the Australian flag. It's quite a well-known constellation. And so this story, the Southern Cross in Guwaarrgay is called Yarran. And Yarran is the Guwaarrgay word for the red gum tree. Oh, actually, sorry, I did forget. I also want to do an acknowledgement of country before I get too far into this. So I will do that firstly in my own language, and then I'll do it in English afterwards. Giingaya ngulay down da nunawula ngambri da warailana. Wayamanga winangailana. Gugunga winangailana. Maringa ngurale winangailana. I'm standing here today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I acknowledge their elders, I acknowledge their ancestors, and I acknowledge the people of this land. Yeah, so like I was saying, this is the Southern Cross, and so this is an important cultural story because the main sort of way in which information was passed from one generation to the next in our culture was through oral traditions. So it was the telling of stories, and so we embedded within these stories important information that needed to be passed down. And this story is the story of the first man to die on Earth. So in the beginning, there were two men and a woman, and they were taught how to live off the earth. So they were shown everything that they needed, from where the watering holes were for water to the trees that they could use for fruit and food to survive, and everything that they needed. But then as time went on, the earth began to change, and the watering holes began to dry up. The trees stopped providing the food that they needed. And it got to the point where one of the men and the woman, they got so desperate, they seen a wallaby hopping by. And they said, I want to kill and eat that wallaby. I'm so desperate for food. And the third man, he goes, you can't do that. The wallaby is our totem. We don't eat our totem. But the first man and the woman, they were so desperate, they killed this wallaby and they ate it. And this caused a lot of distress for the third man. And so he ran and he ran and he ran until he couldn't run anymore. And he fell at the base of the red gum tree, the Yarran. And the spirit that lived within the tree, he seen that the man had done the right thing, that he hadn't eaten his totem. And so he opened up the trunk of the tree, he took in the man's body, and he took the tree up into the sky. And as the tree sort of faded into the darkness, all that was left were the eyes of the spirit and the eyes of the man. And they make up the four main stars of the Southern Cross constellation. But as you may see in this photo here, there's actually two other prominent stars that are quite closely associated with the Southern Cross. And those are the two pointer stars down the bottom here. Because the Yarran, the red gum tree, was actually home to two white cockatoos. And seeing their home being taken up into the sky, they chased it into the sky. And so if you actually look at the Southern Cross and these pointer stars throughout the year as the sky rotates, they actually follow around. And these two white cockatoos are forever doomed to chase their home across the night sky. And so from this, we can look at some of the important information that's contained within this story that needs to be passed on. And in some cases, and in this case, you can break a story down into levels. And so levels are just a sort of a way of compartmentalizing information so that it's perhaps easier to remember. And the first level of this story looks at the physical existence of things. So it explains the existence of the Southern Cross constellation in the sky. It also explains why when you strike a red gum tree that it bleeds red, representing the blood of the first man to die here on Earth. And also why when you stand beneath the tree and the wind passes through the tree that you hear that howling noise of the spirit that lives within the tree. And the second level of this story, it explains some things around important law and ceremony. So it explains the death of the first man, but it also explains the importance of the Yarran, the red gum tree, in burial law, and those sort of aspects of culture. And then the third level, it explains the relationship between us as people and our greater environment. So this explains why totems are important and the fact that we don't kill and eat our totems. And it also explains what happens to our spirit in the afterlife, and actually that transformation from here on Earth and actually moving up into the sky. So that's sort of the first one, and so we can sort of think of that one as a bit of a classical constellation, right? You've got the bright star objects, and you're sort of making connections between the stars to make pictures, to make objects, and that's a sort of classical constellation. Whereas there's a unique feature of Aboriginal astronomy, and that's the idea of what we call dark constellations. And so this, instead of using the bright stars, it actually uses these dark patches in between the stars to make the constellations. So as you can see in the picture here, we've got a picture of the Milky Way. So the Milky Way in Guwaarrgay is called Warrambool, and Warrambool is the Guwaarrgay word for stream or big. Literal translation is big river. So the bool suffix, you can tell if bool's on the end of something that it means big. So Warrambool is big river. And so there's no one story that actually encapsulates the entire Milky Way of itself, but rather there are many stories around the Milky Way, and it's quite a significant object within especially Guwaarrgay astronomy. And so you can actually think of these stories as actual places along the river. And it also highlights another really important aspect of Aboriginal astronomy and cultural astronomy, in that there's a belief that everything that's in the sky is reflected here on Earth. So we can use what we see in the sky then to tell us what's happening here on Earth. And this is a really good example of that. And the most classic and the most well-known of the stories around Warrambool, from especially a Guwaarrgay or Wiradjuri perspective, is the story of Guwaarrgay, the emu in the sky story. So this is the Guwaarrgay version, the Guwaarrgay, but there's a Wiradjuri version, there's a Gadigal version that I know of. There are multiple versions. There are some versions from other parts of the country that use different animals that are more specific to those local peoples. And this is quite a common sort of theme that we find across Aboriginal astronomy from mob across this country. And so this story is a calendar. And so we can tell what time of year it is and what's happening here on Earth based on the appearance of the emu in the sky. And so this starts with this picture that we can see here, and that's that one that I just started with there, where the Milky Way is stretched right out across the sky. And so this happens in sort of April, May, coming into the winter months here in the southern hemisphere. And this is when we first see the emu appear in the sky. And so as you can see from the picture, it's sort of an emu in full stretch, as if it's sprinting along. And so what this signifies is the female emu chasing the male emu. And so from that, we knew that it was breeding season. And when it's breeding season, that means that there are going to be eggs in the nests. So we can go out and we can hunt the emu eggs as a source of food. Very important. Again, this is all about embedding information that's relevant to our survival and the continuation of our culture, and the knowledge about food sources and when they're available is of vital importance. And then again, as the year goes on and the objects rotate in the sky, so does the emu. And then so we've sort of gone now, and now the emu's sort of got its head facing down towards the earth. And now we can no longer see the legs of the emu. All we see is the head and the body. And so what this signifies is the male emu sitting on the nest. So that means that the emu eggs are beginning to hatch. And so very soon we're going to need to stop hunting the eggs, because we don't want the emu population to die out, so that we've got a sustainable food source for next year, so that we continue to survive. And again, so the objects in the sky, they keep moving, and eventually the Milky Way gets very low in the sky. So this is coming towards the end of the year now, October, November. And now you can only just sort of see the body of the emu just above the horizon. And so what this signified was the emu with its head in the watering hole. And so that meant that the watering holes were full, but that we needed to sort of collect the water up now, because the dry season was going to be incoming, and that we needed to make preparations for that dry season in order to, again, to ensure that we can get through to the next season. And then eventually you can no longer see the emu at all. It's sort of dipped below the horizon. That's when you get the summer visions of the Milky Way in the northern hemisphere. And then that means that the emus have sort of left the watering hole. The watering holes are empty. The dry season is upon us. And we need to then just buckle down and get through to that April-May period again, where the emu reappears in the sky. Now, the emu also does have a significant connection to ceremony. And so what you can actually see here, so this is in that second phase where the emu is sort of downward facing, and you can just see the head and the body. And when the emu is actually vertical, sort of straight up and down like this, with its head sort of pointing towards the sky, that meant that it was time to move towards the ceremonial grounds for the Bora ceremony. And it was also, this was the very last point at which we would hunt emu eggs. This was the absolute cutoff point. You wouldn't hunt once the ceremonial preparations were being made. And so now we've sort of began to look at this idea of, okay, using the sky to tell us what's happening here on Earth. And when you do that, you actually then start to be able to delve into the scientific observations that are contained within cultural astronomy. Because so far we've talked about a lot of cultural connections and these essential connections for survival. But what we're now beginning to really appreciate is that there's some really robust scientific observations contained within cultural astronomy. And one of those is the observation of the phases of the moon. And so what you can see here is two paintings. These are by Uncle Segar Passi, who's a Meriam man from the Torres Strait Islands. And so this actually ties the phases of the moon with the seasons and the tides and the weather and what is happening, and using these phases of the moon as a method of weather prediction, which we now understand. We now have a robust sort of understanding of the connection between the moon and the tides and the weather, using Western scientific methods. But what we've got here is a demonstration of that from a cultural perspective, and really embedding that in the art side of things. So this is embedded in art. And so we've got now a wonderful connection between art and science. And that's a really powerful aspect of Aboriginal astronomy, is that there's not that art versus science as that can sometimes appear in sort of Western society. This is really all connected. And for us, there was no separation of art versus science. Everything was connected all in one. And so we start by looking at this photo here. So this is metalug. And if we have a look at the features of this piece of artwork, we can begin to get a bit of an understanding of this. So we have a look, we've got the very large cumulus clouds, and we've got the very choppy, wavy water. And you can actually see the moon. So the moon actually looks like a bit of a bowl here. And so this story goes that when the moon was like this, in this sort of time, that was when the dry season was about to begin. So we'd just come off the end of the wet season, and the moon now has become a bowl. And so instead of the rain actually coming down to earth, the moon is filling up with water, as if it's a bowl filling up with water. And then we go into this second one here. And this is Guwaarrgay. And so now you can see that the clouds have changed in this one. We've got those thin cirrus clouds, and we've got that very calm and flat water. And now the bowl has tipped on its side. And that meant that the wet season was about to incoming. This was about to be monsoon season, and all that water that had been building up in the moon was now about to be poured out and come down here on Earth. And so we've got really cool observations of the phases of the moon and what the moon is doing, and also the connection between that and what the weather is doing and the seasons. And that's all very important information, especially for somewhere like the Torres Straits, where you rely on the sea for a lot of food resources, and you're navigating between islands, and when you can go out on the boats fishing or go between islands and stuff like that. So there's a need to understand the connection between what the moon is telling you is happening and what's going to happen here on Earth. And now I'll give one last story here to sort of really hopefully drive home that point that I want to make here, that there's a lot of really cool scientific observations to be found within Aboriginal astronomy. And this one looks at variable stars. So I don't know if you've had people that have spoken about variable stars in any capacity before, but these are stars that sort of vary in brightness over very quick or astronomically quick periods of time, I should say. And they're a very relevant sort of recent research in sort of Western science. Maybe the last couple of 100 years, we've been looking at variable stars and what they mean, and their sort of the underlying mechanisms of those. And here we have an example in Aboriginal astronomy, which actually has observations of these variable stars. Now this one's also not a Guwaarrgay story, unfortunately. I can't claim this one either. This is from the Kokatha people in South Australia. And so you may be familiar on the left-hand side of this picture here with that constellation. That's the constellation Orion. Our Northern Hemisphere people will be familiar with that one, but it may be upside down for those of us in the Southern Hemisphere. And much like his Greek counterpart Orion, this one's also a story of a fearsome hunter named Yarran. Now, Yarran was a fearsome hunter, but he was not a very good man. He was a bit of a womanizer. He didn't treat women very well. And then one day he decides that he wanted to take one of the sisters. So they're represented by the Pleiades cluster, which is on the cluster on the very right-hand side of the picture here. And he decides that he wants to take the younger sister in particular to be his wife. And the oldest sister, Guwaarrgay, she gets word of this and she won't allow it. She doesn't want her young sister to be married to such a nasty man. And so she positions herself in between the sisters, the Guwaarrgay, and Yarran. And she's represented by the Hyades cluster, which is the cluster in the middle of the screen here. And this angers Yarran because no one should stand up to Yarran. He's a fearsome hunter. And the fact that someone stands up to him really angers him. And in his anger, he raises his club, and his club is filled with fire magic. And that club is represented by this bright star up here, which is Betelgeuse, which you may have heard of. It was causing quite the stir at the end of 2019, start of 2020. And when it did vary in its brightness quite significantly. And so he raises his club, and it's got this fire magic. But Guwaarrgay actually has fire magic of her own. And that's represented by this bright star in the Hyades cluster called Aldebaran. And so we've got this back and forth fight between Nairuna and Kambugura. And as these stars flare in brightness, that's the flaring of their fire magic as this battle goes back and forth. And this story for me is just a really cool example of the scientific observations that are contained within cultural knowledge, and the ways in which we can perhaps use cultural knowledge to help better inform our practices in Western science, which is a big part of what I'm now beginning to do as part of my MPhil. Yeah, so that's about all I have. I did promise Ryan I was going to do a supernova story, but I haven't quite got around to that yet, unfortunately. But yeah, there's so much within this, far more than I can do in an MPhil, far more than I can probably do in a career. And so one of my sort of goals is to sort of be a pioneer in this area and try and get more of our young, especially our young Indigenous students, interested in this area, and really that sort of interdisciplinary mindset of science and art and culture, and the fact that there isn't a separation. And in fact, the more you sort of incorporate them into each other, the more rich and full a knowledge and a picture you can paint. So thank you.